I was a child, my church did something that a lot of Protestant congregations were doing back then. We watched a film series called How Should We Then Live? And then we read a book by the same name that accompanied the film series. And when I say we, I don't necessarily mean me. I certainly watched the films with my parents and other adults from the congregation, but I didn't read the book until I was in college. At any rate, the book was written by the famous evangelical leader Francis Schaeffer, and the films were made by his son, Frank Schaeffer. And as best as I can remember it, the film series and the books were meant to convey the idea that Western civilization took a turn for the worse when artists stopped honoring God and God's creation in their art. The idea was that during the Renaissance, artists honored God by exploring God's creation through representational art. Whether this art was strictly religious or more secular in nature, the artists of the 15th through 19th centuries represented the very highest aspirations of Western culture because, according to the Schaeffers, they honored the Creator by making accurate depictions that explored God's creation. Well, then came the rise of modern art, which starting with the Impressionists, and then the Cubists, and then abstract artists of various kinds, began to rip at the moral fiber of Western culture. According to the Schaeffers, the worst, the very nadir of Western art was Jackson Pollock, whose work often relied on random drips and splashes of paint, or at least that's what the Schaeffers thought of it. To them, it was chaos. It was seen as a threat. No longer did artists honor God by exploring creation through representational art. Instead, they tore apart creation by throwing random paint at the wall. Well, then I went to college and I took a survey of American music class from a trombonist whose jazz compositions somewhat resembled a musical expression of a Pollock painting. And he told a classroom full of evangelical students, most of whom had grown up on Schaeffer books and films, that it was actually abstract art and avant-garde music that were the highest expression of Christian values, because in abstract art and in avant-garde music, the artist creates in the same way God creates, ex nihilo. Out of nothing, the artist does something entirely new. So, what is Christian art? How should we then live? That question about art is a lot like other questions that arise in communities of faith when we talk about what it means to live a Christian life. For example, is Christian morality primarily a matter of personal piety and purity, or is it about things like social justice and societal transformation? A friend and colleague of mine from the Presbytery of San Jose grew up in North Carolina but lived much of his adult life in California. And he once told me, relying somewhat on stereotypes, but it feels pretty accurate, he once told me that white people in California cast liberal votes, but often they're afraid of the guy who does their landscaping. Well, people in the South cast conservative votes, and yet, more likely than not, the landscaper is practically part of the family. So what does Christian living look like? Is it having the right politics, or is it having the right interpersonal relationships? Well, I want to say yes. Yes to all of the above. If a person feels drawn into a relationship with God and God's creation by engaging with representative art and classical music, I can only celebrate that. And if someone finds a deep connection to the Creator by being a creator, doing abstract art, that's wonderful. And I don't see a downside when people inspired by faith take care of themselves and have healthy, life-giving relationships with their families and their communities, especially when those relationships cross boundaries of race and class and orientation and whatever else might divide us. I also believe that Christianity and other faith traditions should move us toward righteous politics. We should work together to create societies and nations where justice rolls down like water and where no child of God goes to bed hungry, and where the beauty of God's image is fully recognized in everyone. Our faith should cause alarm bells to ring like crazy when politicians use racism and demagoguery to divide us and appeal to violence to consolidate their power. The Bible has all sorts of lists and directives that attempt to show us what good and faithful living looks like. some of these lists feel more personal, like, love your neighbor as you love yourself, for example, while others can feel more political, like, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. But whether it's the Ten Commandments or the Beatitudes, I think it usually is the case that there are personal and political or communal interpretations for the Bible's moral teachings. Now that certainly is the case with St. Paul's exhortations in Romans chapter 12, which Sloan read to us in the video that precedes this one. Take, for example, Romans 12, verse 15, which instructs us to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Now that's excellent advice for friendship, for marriage, for parenting, for building solid relationships at work or at church. But it also should have profound political implications. If we are people of faith, and if we're going to be instructed by this bit of spiritual writing, then we cannot be impassive when we learn of mass incarceration or inequities in education or economic opportunities. When police in Kenosha, Wisconsin, straight up attempt to murder an unarmed man, shooting him 7 times in the back and in front of his children, well, that should have a profound impact on us. And when an armed teenager shows up at a protest of this incident and ends up murdering 2 of the protesters and shooting another, and the police let him walk away, only arresting him a day later, and then blame the protesters for being out past curfew, as if that were a capital offense to be meted out by someone barely old enough to drive, then we need to be weeping with those who weep. And when a major political party is holding its quadrennial convention in the midst of all of this, and only responds by stoking racist fears of white suburbanites, then our hearts should break along with all who are heartbroken. And we should protest with those who protest, and march with those who march, and work for change with those who work for change. We'll take also the following verse, which says, "Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are." Again, this is good advice for interpersonal relationships. These instructions can save a marriage or a friendship, but they have political implications as well. Taken politically, I think they suggest that the well-being of white people living in the suburbs or wherever is not more important than the well-being of people of color who live in urban communities or in agricultural communities or any place else. Nor is Eurocentric wisdom greater than the wisdom that comes from Latin America or Asia or Africa. And if we're going to be good people of faith, we need to do the work to make sure that this principle of economic and cultural equality becomes a reality. And having said that, if you completely embrace the need for societal and political change, but you are still afraid of your gardener, or if you go to the supermarket and show disrespect towards the cashier, or if you are well educated and you think that that makes you better than your neighbor who drives a dump truck for a living, well, then I would say that you still have a lot to learn about what this passage is all about. And luckily, there is always time to learn. There's always time to grow. There's always time to become the kind of people the Holy One calls us to be and our faith instructs us to be. A lot of religious traditions tell us one way or another to be moral, and others tell us one way or another to be just. I cannot choose between the two. As far as I can tell, they are both important in different ways. So instead of choosing between morality and justice, I would just say this: God calls us to be good. And that means, at least metaphorically, that we will love both representational and abstract art. We will practice the right kind of politics. We will work for justice. We will dismantle systemic injustice. We will shake off the evil of white supremacy, and we will treat everyone with friendly respect. We will be kinder and more gracious in our interpersonal dealings, and we will work to transform the world. Amen.